More than 90% of Russian UAVs heading toward Ukrainian positions are now being intercepted before impact. At the same time near Pokrovsk, troop carriers, supply trucks, and infantry units are being struck almost immediately as they enter the approach zone, which signals a major shift in how this battlefield is unfolding. This change means the threat is no longer limited to direct clashes at the front, because pressure now builds across the entire space. From the rear air layer where UAVs are stopped, to the roads leading forward, to temporary regroup points, and even to radar and artillery positions that once relied on distance or cover for protection. In this environment, an assault can begin to collapse before it properly forms. Since a vehicle can be destroyed before unloading troops, survivors can be tracked as they scatter. What appears at first to be separate incidents is actually a connected sequence, where interception weakens awareness, early strikes disrupt movement, and follow-up attacks remove any chance to reorganize. Stay with this report to see how only a few minutes under aerial observation can break timing, structure, and coordination at once, and how this pattern is now shaping every stage of the fight. The key question now is no longer how many troops or vehicles can be sent forward, but whether any movement can remain unnoticed long enough to survive in a battlefield where drones are watching almost everything. The first stage of this fight begins in the air behind the front, where FPV drones are already moving to intercept Russian UAVs before any ground unit even starts its approach. One scene shows a Russian reconnaissance UAV flying low and steady, scanning fields and tree lines while sending back a live feed. And at first, nothing seems to threaten it because the sky looks empty from its own camera view. Then a small FPV drone appears at the edge of the frame, still far away and holding distance, as the operator keeps it just outside the detection range, matching speed and direction instead of rushing in. The FPV does not attack immediately because the pilot waits for the right angle, slowly adjusting height and position while watching how the UAV moves and how stable its path is. As the distance closes, the FPV shifts slightly above and behind, where it is harder to see, and the operator keeps the approach smooth to avoid sudden motion that might give away the attack too early. At that moment, timing becomes critical, because if the FPV moves too soon, the UAV may change direction or climb, but if it waits too long, the target may leave the area. The decision comes in a fraction of a second, as the FPV suddenly accelerates, cuts the remaining distance, and dives straight into the UAV, ending the flight before it can transmit anything useful. The screen goes static, and from the ground nothing seems to have changed. Yet that single interception removes a set of coordinates that would have guided fire or exposed a position. In another case, a Russian UAV tries to adjust its route, flying slightly higher as if reacting to interference. But a second FPV has already been tracking it from a different angle, staying low and using terrain to remain hidden. The operator brings it closer step by step, not in a straight line but with small corrections, keeping the drone steady while watching the target's behavior and waiting for the moment when the UAV stabilizes again. Once the path becomes predictable, the FPV commits, rising quickly from below and striking before the UAV can react. And the entire sequence lasts only seconds after the final approach begins. What matters here is not only the hit itself, but how early it happens, because these UAVs are removed before they can mark targets, before they can guide artillery, and before they can support any movement on the ground. Each interception quietly changes what comes next, since units moving forward will no longer receive the same level of information, and the picture of the battlefield becomes less clear with every UAV that disappears. From above, it looks like a series of small encounters between drones, but from a wider view, it is the first layer of pressure that shapes everything that follows. The air is no longer just a space for observation, because it has become a place where information is cut off before it can be used, and that loss begins to affect decisions even before vehicles start moving. If the eyes of the operation are being removed this early, then the next phase becomes inevitable, because ground forces will still move forward, but they will do so without the same awareness that once guided them. And that is where the fight shifts toward Pokrovsk, where the roads ahead are no longer just routes to the front, but areas where movement without information quickly turns into exposure. The next phase of the attack begins the moment a Russian troop carrier reaches the edge of the approach zone, because that is where movement stops being an advantage and starts becoming a trap. The vehicle comes in fast along a damaged track near Pokrovsk, throwing dust behind it as it leaves a safer line farther back and moves toward the point where infantry is supposed to dismount. From the ground, that short run may look like the most protected part of the push, because speed can reduce exposure and keep the formation moving before Ukrainian fire fully reacts. From above, the picture is very different. A reconnaissance drone has already been holding contact on the route, watching the carrier close the final distance and confirming that it is not just passing through, but actually moving into a deployment point. That is the key moment. The target is no longer a moving shape on a road. It is now a loaded transport arriving exactly where troops are about to step out and form the first line of the assault. The strike comes in the few seconds between those two stages. When the carrier slows just enough to turn, the rear section begins to shift, and the men inside are preparing to jump. An FPV drone moves in low and fast, staying steady for the final approach while the operator keeps the nose locked on the center mass of the vehicle. There is no wasted motion in that last run. The pilot does not need a second pass and does not wait for a cleaner shot, because the transport is at its most valuable and most vulnerable at the same time. The impact lands before the unloading is complete, and the result is immediate. The carrier is disabled at the exact point where the attack was supposed to begin taking shape. That single hit changes the rhythm of everything around it, because the convoy behind the first vehicle no longer see a planned entry into the battlefield. They see fire, wreckage, smoke, and a route that may already be compromised. Some troops try to get out quickly and move away from the blast area. Others hesitate because the direction ahead is no longer clear. A few may think the safest choice is to stay low near the road for a moment, while others try to sprint toward the nearest tree line before another drone appears. What was meant to be one smooth transition from transport to attack turns into a broken sequence of individual reactions. The effect reaches beyond the vehicle that was hit, because the push behind it also loses tempo. A second transport cannot move up with confidence when the first one has just been struck at the drop point. Supporting elements now face a choice between pressing forward into the same danger zone or slowing down and risking a wider collapse in coordination. Every extra second creates more pressure. This is why the destruction of that troop carrier matters so much, because it is not simply a loss of one machine. It is the moment when an organized assault begins to lose shape before it reaches the line it was meant to challenge. The route is still there, the soldiers are still alive in some cases, and the order to attack has not disappeared, yet the structure behind that order has already been hit hard. That leaves one question hanging over the battlefield. When the transport is gone and the formation is broken, where do the survivors go next? And do they still have any real chance to regroup before the next strike arrives? The destruction of the first troop carrier does not end the sequence, because the next stage begins with the men who survive and try to disappear before another FPV drone arrives. Some jump clear and run along the edge of the tree line, while others drop into shallow ground cuts, crouch behind bushes, or press themselves against broken earth that looks deep enough to hide a human body from the front. From ground level, that reaction makes sense. The burning vehicle is no longer safe, the road is exposed, and any place a few meters away feels better than staying near the wreck. From above, the picture is harsher, because the movement away from the blast does not look like escape. It looks like a trail. Each figure chooses a slightly different direction, yet all of them are still visible as fragments of the same broken assault, and the overhead FPV keeps that scene in view without rushing to trigger the next strike too early. That choice matters because the goal is no longer only to hit the men who survived the first blast. The more valuable opportunity is to see where the survivors are heading and whether someone from the rear will try to restore the push. Minutes later, that answer begins to appear. A logistics truck moves forward from behind the approach route, carrying ammunition, batteries, and fresh support for the next phase. it is not driving with the speed of a panic move. The drone above sees it early, but the operator does not commit to an immediate strike. Instead, the truck is watched carefully as it leaves the main track and turns toward cover behind a line of trees. That turn reveals the real target. Behind those trees, several soldiers are already pulling in from different directions. Some have come from the destroyed carrier. Others were likely positioned nearby and are now moving toward the same point to help rebuild order. From the ground, that patch of cover may feel like the first place where control can be restored. The FPV feed no longer shows one damaged vehicle and scattered survivors. It now shows a growing cluster, a supply truck at the center, and the first clear sign that the assault is trying to restart. Only then does the strike come. An FPV drone moves in after the gathering point has fully exposed its value. The hit lands at the moment when resupply, regrouping, and command are finally coming back together. That is why the effect is far larger than the destruction of one vehicle. Ammunition that was meant to keep the push alive never reaches the men who need it. Soldiers who believed they had found a brief pause are thrown back into chaos before they can rebuild any structure. The second strike does not simply add damage. It removes the chance to repair the first failure. This is what makes the sequence so severe, because the drone is not just attacking whatever appears first on the screen. It is following the logic of the battlefield and waiting for the moment when one hit can break several functions at once. A single blast near the road created shock, but the later strike behind the trees does something more dangerous. At that point, the infantry is still scattered, the supply line has been exposed, and the attack is no longer moving forward with a clear center. Yet even this is not the end of the chain, because farther back, other systems are still active, still moving, and still vulnerable to the same kind of pursuit. The next stage of the hunt reaches deeper into the Russian system, because once infantry and logistics have already been disrupted, the pressure moves toward the assets that still help hold the wider area together. One of those assets is a radar vehicle moving along a rear route after the front has already begun to shake. It is on the move, likely trying to change position, shorten its exposure, or keep watch over a sector that is becoming less stable by the minute. The vehicle is larger, more distinct, and easier to follow than scattered infantry in cover. An FPV drone closes in and hits first, but the strike does not fully destroy the target. Smoke rises, the vehicle slows, and then it begins to move again. As the radar leaves its original position, it reveals something more valuable than a static target. It reveals a route, a direction, and the fact that the system has already been forced out of its role. The drone overhead keeps contact while another FPV is brought forward. The second approach is calmer than the first one. There is no need to search again, because the target is already marked. The operator simply follows the damaged vehicle as it struggles along a narrow path, then chooses the final angle and drives the drone in to finish the job. At that point, the loss is not only the machine itself. The sector also loses a key pair of eyes at the exact time when other units behind the line may still need warning and coordination. The same pattern appears in wooded positions where Russian artillery tries to use cover as protection. A gun like a 2S-19 EMS-S or a D-30 may be placed under branches, beside trunks, or in a narrow clearing where the canopy breaks up its shape from above. The first FPV does not go straight for the center of the gun. It comes in low and clips branches near the position, tearing open part of the cover and exposing more of the weapon. A second drone then has a clearer lane. Once the angle opens, the attack becomes much cleaner. The operator can now aim at the barrel area, the breech, or the crew section, and one accurate strike is enough to turn a concealed firing point into a disabled asset. Even night does not end this pressure, it extends it. After dark, vehicles and men moving between positions begin to stand out through thermal optics in a different way. What disappears to the human eye on the ground becomes easier to isolate from above when the background cools and engines, bodies, and fresh tracks hold heat. A truck crossing a gap between trees, a crew shifting around a gun, or a damaged system trying to relocate can all be picked up again once the light is gone. That changes the old rhythm of the battlefield because darkness no longer guarantees a pause. It only changes how the target is seen. In each case, the strike is not always immediate. The pressure does not stop with one blast or one sighting. It continues until the target has either vanished completely or been finished. And once systems like radar and artillery are being pulled into the same chain, the next question becomes even more serious. What happens when the air defense layer behind them starts entering that same kill zone as well? The final part of this sequence becomes even more serious because the pressure does not stop with infantry, trucks, radar, or artillery, and instead begins to reach the air defense systems that are supposed to protect everything behind them. A panzer position may sit deeper in the rear and look far removed from the confusion closer to the front, yet that sense of distance becomes misleading once the earlier layers of the attack have already started to fail. The interceptors in the rear have already reduced aerial awareness. The troop carrier near Pokrovsk was struck before the assault could form. The survivors scattered and were then pulled into a second disaster when the logistics truck exposed the regroup point. A panzer crew may still believe it holds an important shield over the area, because that vehicle is built to protect other assets, warn against threats, and help keep the rear from turning into open ground for enemy drones. Yet once its position is found, its role becomes a burden. It is no longer just protecting the sector. It has become one of the most valuable targets inside it. That is what changes the meaning of the next strike. The attack is not simply aimed at destroying one launcher. It is aimed at thinning the layer that still gives the rear some structure. The sequence usually begins before the final hit. A reconnaissance feed holds contact on the location, watches for movement around the system, and confirms whether it is active, relocating, or still covering nearby routes and storage points. Then the strike comes when the crew is least able to hide the vehicle or shift it quickly enough. Once the panzer is hit, the result spreads beyond the machine itself. The area behind it becomes less secure because the routes, depots, support vehicles, and other systems that once sat under its coverage now face a wider opening above them. Ground troops reached the approach zone and were broken before they could organize. Survivors tried to pull away and were then caught again when support moved in. Radar and artillery could not stay outside the pattern even when they shifted positions or used cover. This also explains why every new adjustment can create another weakness. Smaller groups may be harder to hit at once, but they are easier to isolate. Faster movement may shorten exposure, but it can also push vehicles into the kill zone before they are ready. More light transport can keep supplies moving for a time, but it also adds more targets to routes that are already being watched. The side trying to recover momentum is forced to change again and again, while the side controlling the air above only needs to keep that chain active. That is why this story is bigger than one clash near Pokrovsk. It shows how modern war can strip away protection layer by layer until even the systems meant to secure the rear are drawn into the same cycle of detection, pursuit, and destruction. And once that happens, the question is no longer only how an assault fails. The real question is how any force can keep operating when the whole battlefield, from the front to the deep rear, is being compressed into one continuous zone of risk. What stands out most in this entire sequence is that the attack did not collapse because of one burning vehicle or one exposed group of soldiers, but because every link behind that movement was hit one after another until the whole push lost shape. The Russian UAV layer was cut back first, then the survivors were chased into cover, and when a supply truck tried to rebuild momentum, that regroup point was exposed as well. After that, the pressure moved deeper, reaching radar, hidden artillery, and finally the air defense layer that should have protected the rear. That is the real warning here. This battlefield is becoming a place where mistakes do not stay local for long. One delay can expose a road. One damaged vehicle can pull in more men, more supplies, and more drones. One forced relocation can create the next target. From this point forward, the next Russian attacks may become smaller, faster, and more flexible, because the old way of moving in larger visible patterns is becoming harder to sustain. But the open question is whether those changes will be enough when aerial surveillance and FPV pressure keep tightening every stage of movement. If this kind of battlefield breakdown is worth following, like the video, share it, and subscribe to Military Force. The next phase of this war may depend on one simple question: which side can still move before it is seen?